Autistic radio is personal and it's informal, which means that those taking part speak only for themselves. If they mention an organisation that they work for or they're a member of, they're not speaking on behalf of that organisation. We shouldn't take any implication from that. It's also the case that people's opinions change over time. So while this recording is there forever, people change.
We're recording. Okay, we've been discussing this for a little while in the group, and as you know, I've had some personal conversations with Andrew Swartfigger, who represents an ABA organisation, and my first model was to speak to him, put out some podcasts, and then see how things worked. And I have done that. We have got a podcast that we put out with about him, and that hasn't caused a huge amount of controversy. During radio days, I played 2 excerpts from conversations with Andrew on the 4th day. And again, we haven't had a huge amount of uproar. I haven't seen any negative comments going across the media. So far, I would say that we're positive on not having made a mess of it yet. But I did email Andrew to say that I was still concerned that we have to do this in a sensible way. We agreed that we would offer to use the audio model for him, where we listen to some of those conversations and then put our own ideas and our own reactions to those edited so that we can then present them to him, and then he can use that to encourage other people in his profession to have a conversation with us, an open conversation, equity and communication. So is everybody comfortable with that? Anybody got any reservations on that?
The topic itself is going to be, quite sensitive, but the approach that we've taken so far, that you've taken so far, Julian, seems reasonable to me. So I'm happy with it.
Yeah, I've got no reservations. I listened to the thing from Day 4 of Radio Days. I think I've heard some of that. I definitely had some of that before. And yeah, I mean, what he says from that doesn't sound to me like the kind of trauma of ABA that people have spoken about, people are open about. But I do think it's definitely a good approach to be very equitable about how the conversation happens and how that's accessed by other people. So it's a 2-way rather than a 1-way.
I think that's the point. If it's a 2-way amongst us as a group, rather than me just being a maverick going off and speaking to the guy, if we have more than one of us putting their own thoughts to it, we can't be accused of just giving somebody a platform without any balancing comment from ourselves. I think my main concern was that if we put out things that were just me and him speaking, it would look as though we were platforming the guy, and that would mean that we wouldn't get the breadth of conversation going. We wouldn't hear the voices because they would be put off from joining in. They would perhaps at first sight say, oh, it's another one of these things, let's keep away from it. So I think if we have enough of us speaking, we can also encourage other people to broaden out the conversation without getting, I think the modern world is cancelled. Not that there's been any obvious cancelling at the moment, but we need to be cautious so that we keep a breadth of voices, I think.
Yeah, this is a very news night, I'm doing air quotes, news night way of doing it. We've got different voices for balance.
Yeah, Nigel Farage will be on in a moment. Okay, right. I'm going to play a bit of the audio if everyone's okay with that.
Yeah.
I think the nice thing so far is I feel we have built a trust. I never wanted anybody to feel that I was questioning their profession or being one of those people that
had a flag to wave. Really, I come from entirely outside autism. My only experience of autism is recently being diagnosed as autistic. Somebody like yourself has been considering autism for perhaps the majority of your career. You seem ahead of me. What do I need to know about it?
It's almost all that I've done, apart from we travelled for a year, and then I worked on a building site for a couple of years, just as I was trying to decide what I wanted to do, and then circle back round to working with autistic people and their families. So that's been the entirety. And now it's around service delivery. It's working with this idea of how do we provide our models on a larger scale to local authorities that are, for example, have a service for suicide prevention.
What is the model?
Good question.
What is it we're trying to achieve? I mean, when I first started broadcasting with the guys, I thought that what we would be doing would be something quite simple. I thought we would be advancing a little bit of a positive version of autism to just counteract some stereotypes and give other autistic people bits of inspiration and, reduce the limits that they feel. That's what I thought we were doing. And what's happened is that more and more we've ended up with this lovely situation that the professionals are willing to speak to us on an eye-to-eye basis. Now what do I do with that? What do you recommend me to do with that? I have now a number of professionals willing to speak to me. What do I do?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because behind that question for me, so what it makes me think is almost the perception and the goals or outcomes for autistic individuals across the decades has changed as a picture. So it used to be very much, and I know people who I've listened to people talk, I've spoken to people on a one-to-one basis, and they've said that the medical model has left people feeling a perception of deficit or can't achieve.
Funny having both of those in the same breath. Perception of deficit is what most folks would agree is a target to avoid, the casting of limits onto you, but can't achieve brings in someone potentially having ambitions for you to achieve, which is not necessarily liberating. And as we know, it can be, because it's casting something onto you, just as bad as the other one. So it's got to pin to the wall the carefulness with those two.
They've said that the medical model has left people feeling a perception of deficit or can't achieve. And I don't know if I use the word entirely correctly, but this kind of environment of ableism, in that everyone has to try to be not what they are in so much as being autistic, which I think was the recovery model, right?
Yeah.
Get past it, get over it, cure it, treat it, whatever it happens to be. And I think
Accelerate the way a child develops.
yes, I think you might still do that now in the sense of education. So if you're a child in a school, stripping back and any other extenuating circumstances, a child in school is there to learn.
I think what Andy says about the recovery model is a really important aspect to understand about the end goals of any kind of treatment, intervention or support for autistic people and for anyone else really. Although no, specifically in terms of autism, we're not looking to recover, because it's not an illness, it's not a disease from which you get better. It's something that you learn to live as, and that you learn to navigate the challenges you have, either by changing things about the way you do things. So you may change when you go to the shops to go at a less busy time, for example, or requesting accommodations or whatever it happens to be. But the recovery model is a very useful way of understanding the end goals of treatments, because you can't recover from autism. That's just not how it works. There's been a criticism that's been leveled a lot at the way people have looked at autism treatment and interventions in the past. I know Temple Grandin was once described, this is in the early 90s, when autistic people were all non-speaking and all intellectually disabled. That was just the way people like us didn't exist. And Temple Grandin was described as a recovered, in inverted commas, autistic person. And it's important to understand that history, that attitude, that way of looking at things, in order to really understand the criticisms that are levelled at ABA as the community perceives it at the moment.
When the conversation went like this, it surprised me, because I have associated ABA, the little I know about it, as part of a recovery model, fixing people. I think that's where most autistic people start from. And then this guy is biting that bullet and talking about it immediately. That surprised me.
Yeah, it surprised me a lot as well, actually. And if I had just kind of accidentally stumbled upon this piece of audio and listened to it without knowing who the guest was, without knowing who Andy is, like as in what he what he does for a living, all that kind of stuff. If you then asked me, what do you think Andy does? I'd have said, he sounds like he's possibly, he works in autism services, possibly with floor time, DIR, and he's got a progressive attitude towards supporting autistic people to develop executive functioning skills and life skills. I wouldn't have said this guy's an ABA at all. So I think it's important. It's interesting that we both had the same reaction to that. I think it's important that people try to listen to what Andy says without having that kind of spectre, the looming spectre of ABA over it, because what he says is not at all what I was expecting him to say. No, and kudos for him for going in early with this stuff. There's no chit chat in this, which is great.
So if you're a child in a school, stripping back and any other extenuating circumstances, a child in school is there to learn. If they're learning at a particular rate, can they learn faster? It's a very typical model of education, isn't it? Get through this, get your qualifications, go to the next stage, stretch yourself, push yourself, be the best that you can be type ethos, which seems quite virtuous. But I think we do find ourselves now, and more so as legislation, government changes to funding mechanisms, attitudes and so forth continue to change, and not for the better. There's a contradiction, and I think it's a three-way issue. So you have legislation that demands a right to mainstream education for all children.
Let's crystallise that. All parents have the right to have their child educated in the mainstream, and that means the mainstream has to adapt it.
Yeah, well, kind of, where the contradiction comes.
Yeah, I was expecting it to. I mean, the mainstream has been getting it wrong, hasn't it? And yet, who's the appearance serving this, that there should be a commitment to the mainstream as if it's desirable? It's just making it look desirable to the public, but exactly what we're talking about, stretching to be the best. That's the type of thing that I came a cropper on from not having my own stretch abilities recognised, and I think our generation did.
There's so in terms of access to mainstream services, I think the idea behind autistic people having a right, or anyone else with challenges to learning in a mainstream school setting. The idea is that by enshrining our right to the mainstream services ensures that we're not excluded as standard, so that we are not told, no, you can't have that because it's mainstream, and you can't do that because autistic people can't be in mainstream school. It's the same with health and social care services. We have the right to access mainstream services with reasonable adjustments. So it means that we can't go to the GP and they say, well, you're autistic, so you can't access the mainstream ones. So I see the other side to it, but the idea is that by saying that we have the right in law to access those mainstream services ensures that we cannot by default be excluded.
Excluded from something that works. I mean, the reasonable adjustments, schools just don't adjust everything in the nature of their structure. The idea actually is a service to be subject to the things they do to your learning environment. Grates on me logically, it's just not a service, but let him continue to develop that.
I think we know you, Maurice, as somebody who has been, in the past, completely failed by the education system here in the UK. And a whole group of people who are autistic, who are definitely trying to access the education system as it stands at the moment. We are a wide group of people, but there is also a lot of exclusion going on where people have found the education system so unsuitable for them that they get no access to the kind of education that would lead them to get the milestones to progress in other ways, maybe getting onto higher education or into careers. So there's a whole balance here that is difficult to deal with.
So the legislation from 2014 switched to what people will now recognise as education and healthcare. That document, I understand it's very difficult, but the pathway from recognising that adaptations need to be made, getting diagnosis for whatever one may be experiencing, are you autistic, are you dyslexic, or what have you, and then translating that into evidence of need that becomes a provision that is within the plan, is a very long, arduous journey. The government's central funding to local authorities is being cut systematically over time. The response from central government appears to be telling local authority commissioners, well, look, you have your money, it's up to you how you spend it, it's not our fault if you're running out of money. But it's nonsense because, and I don't want this to become a political thing, but what I have observed is local authorities will then therefore change thresholds for what gets support, which diminishes the ability of mainstream schools to meet the needs of those children within them on every level. So unless you learn typically, and by that I just mean the sort of one-size-fits-all type rinse-repeat scenario, unless you have you're lucky to have a highly skilled teacher, you're lucky to have a head teacher that actually cares about inclusion on a level that is beyond having to get the right SATs results or the progress scores in GCSEs or what have you, you're disadvantaged if you have an additional need, in my opinion.
Very honest of you to say. Okay, he's going to use a made-up term to say that somebody's needs or special needs are called blue book because he looked at a blue book. So we're supposed to have this idea that there is a certain condition called blue book which creates needs.
Just second the compliment that you can clearly be a professional and recognise that reality of the system's box ticking and going by appearances.
So you're putting something in, Maurice, here to be complementary to the way he has described some of this, yeah?
Yes, it's the realism, the recognition.
I'm hoping this audio will go out to some of his colleagues So having somebody like yourself who is open-minded enough to, from a background where you also have taken the schooling system very seriously and been involved in various advocacy projects to do with changing schools, to have you be open-minded enough to agree, I think is going to come across well to them.
You're disadvantaged if you have an additional need, in my opinion.
Very honest of you to say.
The story doesn't really end there. Let's just say your additional needs are called Blue Book. Just it's the first thing I can see, right? So you have Blue Book, or you are in a Blue Book community. So you're in a mainstream school. All you need is Blue Books in your classroom to enable you to fulfill your education, if you like, or be able to access it. But the government funding is that there's no more Blue Books. What happens to you then is that your set of needs can easily met. They're not complicated mechanisms to meet them. But without the funding and the know-how, that child, a hypothetical child, then slides into the special school system. And when that child goes into the special school system, the child that would ordinarily have been in that special school then effectively moves to alternative provision, so not quite schooling, maybe in a pupil referral unit, maybe something like that, or the independent sector, schools that have multiple local authorities sending to them. In effect, the independent sector is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. It is the most expensive way of doing things because it's supposed to be for children whose needs can't be met anywhere else. And so not only are local authority budgets being cut for the mainstream typical education that could be more malleable if they have the funds and the know-how, and the independent sector is picking up kids that they really shouldn't have in their system because every child has a right to school, of course, and they will serve that function, but it's at a premium.
I know someone locally who went to some, maybe autism, but wider defined specialist school in North England, so it's a sort of boarding, because it was clearly remote from home, and it sounds like that's an example of a provision found at a pretty great distance. So it's more than just the neighbouring district sometimes. We can recognise the pattern of Tory subcontracting in it, and who that's profiting.
So the money is becoming less and less available there too. Somebody once described it as a bit of a time bomb. So what do you do with the information? It's kind of getting it all out there in one place, because we're looping back round to, I think, a very generic position, which will be no one's fault. But the casualties, the children whose needs could be met just by an environmental change or something that's relatively subtle, hypothetically speaking, that child's chances are diminished. That's what I worry about.
That's your fear.
The purpose and role then, in my view, of behaviour analysis, in my experience in any case, has always been to try to help children to access things more easily whilst getting other people to understand what they need.
You don't want to access through fitting into the box. You want the box to fit you, but let's see him develop that.
What it all comes down to, unfortunately, it doesn't matter what we talk about, it doesn't matter the topic, it's always down to money and funding. And when it's gone down to, we're trying to encourage, the individual basis, people are treated with individual respect of who they are and getting, what they have a right to. But you're up against this constant cutting and funding and centralisation. So when they're centralising funding, they're also centralising people. Then they put people into boxes, and that's what makes it harder to make these sort of things work because of that. That's what I'm getting from some of the conversations so far, as well as Liz and Boris has already discussed about other parts. It does seem very positive, though, in terms of the way Andy's speaking. So it sounds very, there's always a fear that the discussion would turn into, it'd be quite it is a difficult listen, but it's a more comfortable listen I thought it would be. Even though I have listened to some of it, previously. But this is the first time I've actually kind of listened to it, get through it quite full. So, but, I'm quite enjoying what's been said so far, and I look forward to its continuing.
I think a lot of discussion of the education system is probably less relevant to people looking at this topic from this, looking at ABA as the topic of ABA rather than the myriad failings of the education system. And while I'm not saying it's not an important thing to discuss at all, but I'm not sure that autistic people listening, if an autistic person listens, sees, here's a discussion or talking about an ABA, talking about somebody who is an ABA proponent, I'm not sure they're going to find the discussion and takedown of the way the education system's managed to be what they are expecting to hear in this. And I don't know if I don't know what the content is of the other 3 hours or so of recording. I just wonder whether there might be, whether there's something that if we want to open the floor to other people to put their voices in on the subject, is there content that's it's a bit broader, perhaps?
I think we have to get the ABA practitioners and his colleagues to the table yet.
Autistic radio is personal and it's informal, which means that those taking part speak only for themselves. If they mention an organisation that they work for or they're a member of, they're not speaking on behalf of that organisation. We shouldn't take any implication from that. It's also the case that people's opinions change over time. So while this recording is there forever, people change.